Gordo, Novo México. Nascia a Era Atômica. Esta é a história de um filho esquecido do otimismo da época inicial do poder atômico. Como antes da corrida espacial dos anos 60, a América e a Rússia investiram bilhões em mais uma disputa tecnológica, a construção de uma aeronave gigantesca e movida a energia nuclear. Uma aeronave tão fantástica que poderia permanecer em voo ininterrupto durante meses. Livre de vínculos com a Terra e com bases vulneráveis, ela seria a derradeira máquina do juízo final. Aviões que nunca voaram. O bombardeiro atômico. Hoje, a energia atômica é vista com desconfiança, até mesmo temida. Mas por um tempo, logo após a Segunda Guerra Mundial, as coisas eram diferentes. O público americano foi tomado de uma alegre nucleomania. Logo, a eletricidade seria barata demais para se medir. Haveria carros, trens, helicópteros e cargueiros movidos a energia atômica.
Well, the public perception about nuclear power, right after the war and for probably 20 years thereafter, was very positive. People talked about it coming very soon, and they talked about power too cheap to meter and other optimistic remarks like that. Some people talked about using it everywhere, you know, for transportation of all kinds.
There was even a scheme, I mean, totally mad from today's perspective, to detonate atomic bombs over the North and South Pole to melt the ice, give the world a warmer climate.
E haveria aeroplanos movidos a energia atômica. Já em 1942, Enrico Fermi e seus sócios no projeto Manhattan, que construíam a primeira bomba atômica, tinham discutido a perspectiva de usar energia atômica para dar propulsão a uma aeronave. A grande vantagem que a energia nuclear poderia dar era uma autonomia quase ilimitada. Em 1950, o reabastecimento em voo ainda não havia sido aperfeiçoado, embora experiências feitas pela Inglaterra no período entre as guerras tivessem mostrado que a tecnologia de transferir combustível entre dois aviões em voo era perfeitamente viável. Mas na era anterior ao jato, levar uma carga de gasolina que valesse a pena para transferir para outro avião era um projeto impraticável.
Now, the British had actually done some limited experiments in-flight refueling before the war, but what they'd found was that you could not transfer significant amount of fuel to make a real difference in the range.
Não houve reabastecimento em voo na Segunda Guerra Mundial. Os B-17 e os B-24 americanos, que operaram sobre a Alemanha, foram massacrados porque as escoltas dos caças, com sua pouca autonomia, não podiam acompanhá-los em voo. Só com os caças como o Mustang, especialmente equipados com tanques de combustível maiores, os bombardeiros à luz do dia puderam ser realizados sem perdas enormes sobre a Alemanha nazista. O raio de alcance dos aviões era uma preocupação constante para as Forças Armadas Americanas. Em 1937, a Divisão Aérea do Exército designou o Lockheed P-38 como interceptador de caça de longo alcance para operar sobre tudo no Pacífico. Quando entrou em ação em 1941, o P-38 tinha uma autonomia de 700 quilômetros.
America had to fight wars like no one else. They had to fight over the Pacific. That meant it needed aircraft with immense range. They also had to fly safely. A single-engine fighter was at risk. If the engine stopped, the plane went down into the sea. You needed two engines. So that meant an airplane, fast, safe, twin-engined. That was the P-38.
Em 1944, a Força Aérea apresentou a Super Fortaleza B-29, uma aeronave com autonomia de 4.500 quilômetros, capaz de bombardear o Japão decolando das bases em ilhas no centro do Pacífico. A Segunda Guerra Mundial também viu o desenvolvimento da tecnologia que resolveria alguns dos problemas da aviação civil americana do pré-guerra. Motores e estruturas maiores e mais eficientes permitiriam que os aviões civis, pela primeira vez, atravessassem os oceanos sem parar para reabastecer. Todos esses desenvolvimentos pareciam anunciar uma nova era em que tudo era possível. Mas esses planos foram influenciados por uma série de novos problemas e desafios. A Guerra Fria, embora apenas no início, passaria a dominar o pensamento estratégico americano nas décadas seguintes. A América precisava de um bombardeiro para atingir alvos dentro da Rússia soviética. Um bombardeiro com um alcance de dezenas de milhares de quilômetros. A resposta surgiu com um tipo de motor radicalmente novo.
In 1946, under the leadership of General Curtis LeMay, the United States Air Force set up a program called NEPA, which stands for the Nuclear Energy Propulsion of Aircraft. This was to oversee the possibilities of designing and building a bomber that would be a nuclear-powered bomber.
Assim como o P-38 e o B-29 tinham fornecido os meios para enfrentar o Japão no Pacífico, um bombardeiro movido a energia nuclear parecia ser ideal para qualquer possível conflito com a Rússia.
The number one advantage, and really any other advantages derived from it, was the fact that they imagined that the flight duration could be greatly extended, almost indefinitely.
Em um ano, foi iniciado o trabalho no projeto de uma das plataformas de guerra mais impressionantes já propostas, um bombardeiro atômico.
Estamos apresentando Aviões que Nunca Voaram.
Em 1948, o chefe do recém-criado Comando Aéreo Estratégico era o general Curtis E. LeMay. Ele comandara o ataque dos B-29 contra o Japão no Pacífico. LeMay tinha fama de ser adepto do confronto, um intransigente.
Well, he was a general who really didn't particularly care for civilians. He was a fighting general from World War II. He had commanded bombing attacks in both Europe and in Japan. So he was a World War general with the kind of attitudes you would expect in a successful general from that period.
LeMay buscava um bombardeiro para enfrentar a nova ameaça soviética que fosse movido por motores nucleares e capaz de se manter no ar indefinidamente. Seria a principal arma da América em qualquer guerra mundial futura.
In military terms, and setting it in the right historical context, this was a great idea, because what it meant was that you could build a bomber that was not constrained by the amount of fuel it carried. So you could have a nuclear bomber, nuclear-powered, carrying nuclear weapons, airborne, all the time, watching and waiting for the enemy.
Mas havia alguém que não confiava em LeMay e na Força Aérea, o presidente Harry Truman.
President Truman was very worried about leaving this awesome power of the atom solely in the hands of the military. So he created a civilian body, the Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC, responsible directly to himself and the office of the president. And this would control all nuclear research, it would control the nuclear reactors, and this really annoyed the generals, it would keep under lock and key the atomic bombs.
A comissão identificou uma série de usos para uma aeronave movida a energia atômica. Primeiro, um bombardeiro de grande autonomia de voo. Teoricamente, a energia de um reator nuclear permitiria que a aeronave voasse durante meses sem reabastecer, usando apenas minúsculas quantidades de urânio. Outra possibilidade era o hidroavião.
The Atomic Energy Commission's pet team of academics at MIT thought that one of the prime candidates for a nuclear-powered aircraft was a passenger flying boat. In those days, air traffic was still very underdeveloped. There weren't that many big airfields could take passenger planes. So flying port to port was quite a good idea. And also, an atomic reactor in an aircraft is quite heavy and a flying boat was big enough to carry it. So that looked like a good bet.
De fato, antes da era do jato, o hidroavião parecia a aeronave mais promissora para a aviação civil de longa distância. O projeto também permitia que mais passageiros fossem transportados e com grande conforto. O milionário Howard Hughes construiu Spruce Goose para transportar passageiros através do Atlântico sem escala. E na Inglaterra, Sanders Roe estava construindo o elegante hidroavião Princess. Era destinado para o florescente mercado de transatlânticos.
They were developing a docking system. In fact, that was in use at Southampton, so you no longer were taken out to your flying boat in motorboats. You'd walked aboard it from docks, and there would have been docks at either end. Drive the aeroplane in, tie it up, and then walk ashore.
O Princess foi uma das maiores aeronaves já construídas.
Well, it was a double-decker, so we had upper and lower decks. We had provision for cocktail bars and all the rest of it, and double berth cabins. It was definitely going to be an upmarket luxury way of crossing the Atlantic in about 7.5 hours.
Um hidroavião movido a energia nuclear poderia ter outros usos. A energia atômica também estava sendo desenvolvida para uma nova geração de submarinos que podiam se ocultar durante meses sob a superfície. Hidroaviões com motores atômicos poderiam ser usados para caçá-los. Setembro de 1949. Um solitário bombardeiro de reconhecimento B-29 recolheu amostras de material radioativo sobre a União Soviética. A Rússia tinha entrado para o clube nuclear. No ano seguinte, a Coreia do Norte invadiu a Coreia do Sul. A Guerra Fria se intensificara. Esses eventos aceleraram o plano de um bombardeiro americano movido a energia nuclear.
The Congressional Joint Committee on Atomic Energy was very much in favor of going ahead with promoting and going ahead with the nuclear bomber. The Atomic Energy Commission itself also was. They developed eventually a special subdivision which did that work. And within the Department of Defense, the Department of the Air Force, there were a lot of great hopes for the nuclear airplane.
Em 1951, a Comissão de Energia Atômica encomendou a produção da primeira aeronave experimental movida a energia nuclear.
The designated aim, as stated in 1951, was to produce 2 flying test beds, so 2 flying nuclear-powered aircraft by 1957. And the program started with a series of testing the shielding requirements for the crew.
The major issue was how to protect the pilot and crew from the effects of radiation coming from the reactor. One solution that was seriously canvassed was only using older crew to fly the aircraft. The theory being that they would be irradiated to some degree anyway, but if they were beyond child-rearing age, then it wouldn't matter so much.
You had to use all these tricks, like base it on uninhabited islands and things like that. Use old men for the pilots, so that the effect of radiation on the gene, on the sperm, would not get into children. They were going to have pilots. They called them the NEPA man.
Para obter experiência em blindagem contra a radiação, decidiu-se construir um reator para voo antes que os motores atômicos ficassem prontos.
Well, they were talking about special aircraft because nobody knew how much it was going to weigh, but it looked like it was going to weigh an awful lot.
A Força Aérea voltou sua atenção para sua maior aeronave, o poderoso bombardeiro Convair B-36. Era o maior bombardeiro americano já construído. Tinha envergadura de asa de 70 metros e autonomia de 13.000 quilômetros. No início, o B-36 era movido por 6 motores a hélice convencionais, mas em versões posteriores foram adicionados 4 motores a jato para dar velocidade e possibilidade de carga, fazendo surgir a frase 6 girando e 4 queimando. Os tripulantes chamavam-no de o sobretudo de alumínio.
The B-36 for the first time gave the American Air Force the capacity of what we now call global reach, global power. That is, that you can reach anywhere in the world with a bomber and influence events there through bombing them.
Em 1953, um bombardeiro B-36 comum foi selecionado como aeronave de teste para o programa do bombardeiro atômico. Foi modificado para transportar um pequeno reator no compartimento de bombas na parte de trás. O reator não era conectado aos motores. Um novo espaço no nariz abrigava um compartimento blindado de 12 toneladas de chumbo e borracha para 5 tripulantes. Piloto, copiloto, engenheiro de voo e 2 engenheiros nucleares. Havia também revestimentos de água na fuselagem e atrás do compartimento da tripulação para absorver a radiação do reator.
After conversion, the aircraft was redesignated the NB-36, the N standing for nuclear. What they did was they took an actual working nuclear reactor and they put it in the aft bomb bay and they flew with it. And the point being, could you protect the crew from the radiation from a working reactor?
The whole essence of this experiment was simply to test whether you could fly a nuclear reactor in an aircraft and not kill the crew through radiation while doing it.
If you couldn't solve that problem, then it didn't matter whether you could make the engines work. No one would fly it.
O primeiro voo do NB-36 com seu reator atômico foi em 17 de setembro de 1955. Os pilotos batizaram-no de The Crusader. Os testes provaram que a radiação podia ser contida se houvesse uma blindagem pesada. O voo, movido a energia nuclear, avançou mais um passo. Mas havia outro problema a resolver. Estava tudo muito bem no voo com o reator, mas e se o avião caísse? Por causa desse perigo, a Força Aérea tomou precauções especiais. Em todas as missões, voava ao lado do NB-36 um avião de transporte da Força Aérea carregando um pelotão de fuzileiros.
The plan was that if ever the NB-36 crashed, the Marines in the accompanying aircraft would instantly parachute out, seal off the crash site from prying eyes, and obviously to protect any nosy civilians. That could have been quite dangerous, and the Marines, being the Marines, they nicknamed this unit the Glow-in-the-Dark Brigade.
Entre 1955 e 57, o NB-36 realizou 47 voos com sucesso.
The problem now was to get an actual working aircraft into the air. And the division of labour was that the Air Force would provide the airframe and the Atomic Energy Commission would provide the working engine.
O sistema de propulsão planejado pesaria 80 toneladas. A unidade nuclear inteira, incluindo o reator, seria construída como um só módulo e removível para reabastecimento e conserto. O desafio agora era chegar a um motor movido a energia nuclear que funcionasse em voo. Um motor a jato comum funciona aspirando ar através de uma entrada e comprimindo-o. Significa que o oxigênio requerido para queimar o combustível é comprimido para dentro da câmara de combustão. O combustível então queima com o oxigênio, causando um aquecimento contínuo e rápido do ar. Este ar aquecido expande-se rapidamente, criando o impulso que dá propulsão à aeronave. Um motor a jato pode atingir grande velocidade. Entretanto, há um inconveniente. Um motor a jato veloz consome muito combustível e o avião carrega pouco. É por isso que jatos militares modernos são tão dependentes de reabastecimento em voo. Mas um motor atômico resolveria esse problema. O processo de combustão combustível-oxigênio é substituído com o calor do reator que dura meses ou anos.
The theory of an atomic engine is very simple. In fact, it's simpler than a jet engine. You simply take the air and you put it into the reactor, which suddenly heats it up. It's not even a chemical reaction. The air just expands, pops out the other end and pushes the plane forward.
A teoria era simples, mas a engenharia não. Os cientistas da Comissão de Energia Atômica apresentaram dois modos de construir um motor a jato atômico.
There were two main approaches to nuclear aircraft propulsion. One of them involved reactors that simply had longitudinal holes and the air came in one end cold, passed through fine holes inside the reactor, became very strongly heated and produced thrust coming out the other end. Well, the advantage of direct power is that it's simpler. There are almost no moving parts. The air goes into the reactor, passes through a lot of little holes through the reactor, comes out hot. So in principle, it's simpler.
O chamado motor de ciclo direto mostrou um grande inconveniente.
The downside to the direct cycle method is that it's very easy for the air passing through the reactor core to become irradiated, either directly if the shielding is weak, or if in the course of time with the heat and dynamic pressures the shielding begins to break down and the irradiated materials begin to flow out of the reactor core, in which case you are spewing dirty material at the back of the aircraft.
Isso levou os cientistas da Comissão de Energia Atômica a propor um segundo tipo de motor atômico, chamado de ciclo indireto.
The other approach was to have a reactor separate from the propulsion system, but on the airplane, of course, which would produce lots of energy, heat. Then that energy would be transferred from the reactor to a propulsion unit, a jet-like propulsion unit, through the use of hot liquid metals.
The indirect cycle has the advantage that you avoid passing the air through the reactor. Therefore, you're going to avoid the problem of any irradiated materials exiting the plane. So what you have to do is to have some medium between the air and the hot reactor, some other substance that will pass from the hot reactor, taking heat, and transfer it to the air. But that means a lot of plumbing, and it's very heavy, and it's difficult for an aircraft.
Estamos apresentando Aviões que Nunca Voaram. Aviões que Nunca Voaram.
Havia agora 2 projetos de motores atômicos. O sistema direto, mais simples, mas mais perigoso, e o sistema indireto, mais seguro, porém mais complexo e mais pesado.
In the race to build the first atomic engine, the General Electric company opted for the direct cycle, the simpler, though potentially dirty system. The Pratt & Whitney company opted for the indirect cycle, safer but more complex to engineer.
Com a continuidade dos testes com o NB-36 e o trabalho com os motores nucleares, o general LeMay e a Força Aérea teciam planos para o bombardeiro atômico.
2, 1, 0.
Nos anos 50, a nova tecnologia de mísseis balísticos ainda estava em fase de desenvolvimento. Os foguetes ainda não tinham uma precisão confiável. E os pilotos dos anos 50 também temiam se tornar meros gerentes de silos nos anos 60.
Many people within the Air Force, especially the older experienced people, simply favored airplanes over missiles, and the nuclear airplanes seemed like, in that sense, it was a godsend. The big advantage that people saw for a nuclear-powered aircraft was simply that the flight duration could be extended indefinitely. That meant the range could be anything you wanted. It means they could stand on station if they were for defensive or observational purposes.
O novo bombardeiro atômico teria uma forma muito diferente de seus predecessores. Deram-lhe o nome de WS-125. O projeto e a construção da aeronave foram confiados à Convair, fabricante do B-36.
The Air Force developed a lot of formal administrative techniques, and one was to classify programs, and WS just stands for Weapon System, and they all had numbers, and the WS-125 was a nuclear airplane.
O plano era que o WS-125 estivesse em operação no início dos anos 60. Nunca lhe deram a letra B de bombardeiro, mas poderia ter sido o B-72. O WS-125 teria um reator posicionado no corpo principal do avião, alimentando 2 motores a jato. Carregaria bombas atômicas ou mísseis. A tripulação ficaria na cabine blindada.
Operationally, WS-125's mission then would be to stand off Russia, the Soviet Union, hanging around the Arctic Circle for days, if not weeks on end, ready to dash in and hit Soviet cities.
Esse avião nuclear seria limitado apenas pela resistência de sua tripulação. Enquanto o trabalho com os motores nucleares prosseguia, os testes com o NB-36 depararam-se com outro problema: a proteção dos tripulantes contra a radiação. A blindagem de chumbo normal, usada em usinas de energia nuclear, seria muito pesada para um avião. Isso o tornaria lento, vulnerável, portanto, a ataques de caças. A solução era distribuir a blindagem.
Instead of having all the shielding in one place, you might have some of it around the reactor, but you might also have some around the pilots.
In an earthbound reactor, you simply surround the reactor with lead, which slows down the various nuclear particles that are flying off. Can't do that on an aircraft because you need lightweight shielding. So what they decided to do was to sort out the different kinds of atomic particles that would be loosed off from the reactor, discover different kinds of shielding, lightweight shielding that would block each, and distribute around the aircraft these different kinds of shielding.
Manter o peso do avião dentro de proporções viáveis tornou-se a grande prioridade do projeto.
The ANP continued to focus on the key problem, which was getting the weight of the whole system down. They did this in two ways. One was the divided shield concept, where they were continually trying different tweaks and different materials in order to improve the efficiency of that. The second way they looked at was decreasing the reactor size. The only problem with decreasing reactor size is that in order to keep the performance the same, you have to increase the temperature so that you end up with the same amount of thrust produced by the smaller engine.
O progresso em todas as frentes, motor, blindagem, energia do reator, era lento. E agora, o bombardeiro atômico tinha um rival. A Marinha Americana, sempre com ciúme da Força Aérea, tinha começado seu próprio projeto de um avião movido a energia nuclear.
What the Navy did is it went back to the idea of the original MIT team of the 1940s who talked about flying boats. So the Navy decided an atomic-powered flying boat would be a very good idea.
It would be peculiar if nobody in the Navy thought about using a nuclear reactor for a flying boat, as long as the Air Force is thinking about it for something else.
A Marinha queria uma versão movida a energia nuclear do Martin C. Master, o primeiro hidroavião movido a jato do mundo. Para vencer seu rival da Força Aérea, a Marinha Americana buscou apoio inglês. A Inglaterra tinha um hidroavião gigante capaz de carregar o peso de um reator nuclear, o Princess da Saunders Roe.
The US Navy Bureau asked Saunders Roe to provide a brochure study of putting a nuclear power unit into the Princess flyboat for use by the US Navy. And I seem to remember a sum of $50,000 being paid to us to do the work, and which we did, and delivered not only a brochure but a model of the aeroplane.
Dick Stratton foi encarregado dos testes de voo do Princess.
The main thing was to install a nuclear reactor in the upper deck, which would feed hot gases to the inboard power plants. And the aircraft would take off on turbine fuel, and when it was up and away, they would then switch off the turbines and go over to the nuclear-powered turbines on the big inboard engines. And of course it would stay up for as long as you wanted it to stay up.
Mas a Marinha Americana logo abandonou os hidroaviões movidos a energia nuclear em favor de outro sistema bélico nuclear, o submarino atômico.
The great advantage of the nuclear-powered sub was that you could use the heavy lead shielding in the submarine. Weight was not a problem, and therefore you could also carry a much bigger reactor, and you could shield the crews of the nuclear submarine so it, like the proposed nuclear bomber, could sit undetected underwater off the coast of the United States even to fire its missiles, or off the coast of Russia to fire shorter-range missiles, or indeed almost anywhere in the world to provide that independent and safe nuclear deterrent.
Os dois projetos, o hidroavião movido a energia nuclear da Força Aérea e os submarinos atômicos da Marinha, tornaram-se rivais mortais.
One of the inspirations the Air Force had for building a nuclear airplane was that the Navy had a nuclear submarine, and they weren't about to be left out in this high-tech propulsion area.
A realidade era que o programa do bombardeiro atômico estava em crise.
In 1956, there was some good news and some bad news for the atomic-powered project. General Electric Company at last managed to get a nuclear-powered jet engine prototype working. But the bad side was that the thrust produced was nowhere near enough to lift the whole system off the ground.
A Força Aérea e a General Electric passaram a buscar mais dinheiro para o programa do bombardeiro atômico. Mas elas se defrontariam com um obstáculo inesperado: o presidente Dwight D. Eisenhower.
President Eisenhower, as a military man, was very suspicious of the military-industrial complex, and always suspected that these kind of companies were pushing projects too far and too fast just in order to gain big contracts. His Deputy Defence Secretary then ordered a stop to the X6 and WS-125 programs in the view that they were just far too ambitious. And I think that was a realistic assessment. So he ordered those programs stopped and ordered the agency to concentrate on trying to get the engine right.
Como resultado, o reator voador NB-36 fez seu último voo no dia 28 de março de 1957. Ele foi aposentado em Fort Worth no final de 1957. Foi desmanchado vários meses mais tarde e suas partes radioativas foram queimadas. Parecia que o projeto de um avião nuclear havia sido enterrado. Mas no dia 1º de dezembro de 1958, a Aviation Week, a revista de defesa de maior autoridade da América, divulgou uma história impressionante. A União Soviética tinha colocado em voo um bombardeiro atômico.
They had a picture of it. It was just an artist's conception, but it was a nuclear-propelled airplane.
A 4-engine delta-wing nuclear-powered bomber was reported to be flying from the Moscow area, and this has been independently reported by other sources. The interesting thing about this was that the article claimed that this was not just a test bed for flying a nuclear reactor around in, but it was actually a nuclear-powered bomber, and this really put the Americans on their toes.
A América já sabia que os soviéticos tinham colocado em órbita o primeiro satélite, o Sputnik. Parecia que os russos estavam à frente tecnologicamente.
Well, Sputnik in America was a negative surprise, because here is a high-tech accomplishment by these backward communist Russians. And so the only way that could happen is, I'm quoting now, is that something is wrong. Something's wrong in America that has to be fixed. And the people who cause this to be wrong are people like Eisenhower, who, are not sufficiently imaginative about when they deal with these great ideas, and it's got to be fixed. So there was tremendous pressure on the government and within the government to just do project after project after project, all in response to Sputnik. I mean, we were going to respond to Sputnik in 100 ways.
Uma das maneiras era ressuscitar o projeto do avião nuclear. A Força Aérea e políticos simpatizantes lançaram uma campanha para restabelecer o WS-125.
There really were passions connected to this nuclear airplane. And one of them was the Democrat from a labor district in Pennsylvania named Dan Flood. And he had this article in Aviation Week with this picture. You guys are asleep at the switch again,
Representative Melvin Price, chairman of the Joint Congressional Atomic Energy Subcommittee, actually declared that the Russians were now 3 to 5 years ahead of the Americans in terms of nuclear aircraft propulsion, and declared that the Americans ought to really do something and step up their efforts to get even.
I remember one classified meeting we had with one of the military appropriations committees of the House of Representatives about this Aviation Week article. Why aren't you guys doing so? Don't you understand how important this is? But I knew enough about the level of Soviet technology to not take it seriously. I mean, I knew how hard it was to do. And I didn't think I didn't think we could do it, and I certainly didn't think they could.
De fato, a Rússia trabalhara em segredo em torno de um avião movido a energia nuclear durante muitos anos.
There was one really wild project they had in the early 50s for a flying boat that weighed 1,000 tons. But the real emphasis of the Soviet military was to keep pace with the Americans and build their own version of a nuclear-powered bomber.
Os soviéticos já tinham um bombardeiro estratégico de longo alcance. No Ocidente, ele era conhecido sob o codinome da OTAN, o Urso. Mas o Urso era lento demais para penetrar as defesas de mísseis e de caças da América. Agora, parecia que a Rússia estava desenvolvendo uma alternativa nuclear. Era chamado de M-50. Seu codinome na OTAN era Bounder. Mas como os soviéticos tinham ultrapassado a América em aviões movidos a energia nuclear?
The Soviet researchers into nuclear-powered aircraft paralleled the American ones. They had the same problems to confront. The weight of the reactor, the shielding, and they came up with much the same kind of solutions. The Russians went down the distributed shielding route as well. Curiously, the Soviet figures for the weight and size of the reactor they wanted to fly with is very similar to what the Americans came up with, about 80 tons.
Estamos apresentando Aviões que Nunca Voaram.
Notícias sobre o êxito do avião atômico soviético aliado ao lançamento do Sputnik mudaram a política americana.
The AEC, the Defense Department, or several Defense Department officials, and the Air Force then threw their weight behind an effort to get the program back up to the prestige level and the amount of input that it had before, and tried to urge the president to back it so that the Americans could have a plane flying by the early 60s.
O presidente Eisenhower elevou o orçamento para o projeto do avião atômico da América, mas continuou desconfiado e colocou o programa sob uma administração em que pudesse confiar.
By that time, I had already developed very substantial doubts about its practicality. The goal is a reasonable goal. I mean, an airplane with an indefinite flight time. But the practicality, and I could summarize it in three different areas, all of which are closely related. One is that airplanes are subject to crashing. The idea of flying around with a reactor, which sadly might crash anywhere, is just not something which could be made acceptable. The second point is that especially on the direct drive, or the direct reactor, direct heat, it was inevitable that it would constantly be spewing radioactivity out the tail. And the other one was the pilots. I mean, the question of shielding the pilots was a serious one.
Herb York was a good scientist who knew that they hadn't cracked the four major problems. They still hadn't built an engine that was powerful enough to get the whole shooting match off the ground. They still hadn't solved the major shielding problems. The direct cycle engine was still too dirty to be considered, and the indirect cycle, the technology was simply too immature.
Apoiado por Eisenhower, York impôs novos objetivos ao projeto. Ele cancelou o desenvolvimento da estrutura do avião por ser prematuro. O trabalho se concentraria em obter um motor perfeito. Houve progressos nesse trabalho. A General Electric fez uma série de experiências bem-sucedidas usando o conceito de ciclo direto. O motor funcionava normalmente apenas com energia nuclear.
The General Electric Company were eventually able to get their direct cycle engine working routinely. So the concept was proved. The trouble was they still couldn't crack the weight problem. The plane and the engine still couldn't get off the ground.
Enquanto a General Electric trabalhava no motor atômico a jato de ciclo direto, a Pratt & Whitney ainda trabalhava no ciclo indireto. O Dr. York considerava que a abordagem do ciclo indireto, com a perspectiva de menos vazamentos perigosos de radiação, era o melhor projeto de motor.
However, even with all this renewed vigor in terms of engine research, even by 1959, real progress had been very slow, and a working prototype was not even in sight.
Em 1960, o quadro político mudou outra vez. John F. Kennedy foi eleito presidente dos Estados Unidos, vencendo Richard Nixon, o vice-presidente de Eisenhower. Kennedy acusara o governo republicano de Eisenhower de permitir que a União Soviética ultrapassasse a América em tecnologia e em força militar. Kennedy reiniciaria o projeto WS-125?
During the presidential election campaign, Kennedy blamed Eisenhower for allowing America to fall behind Russia in military terms. He blamed Eisenhower for what he called the missile gap, that Russia had more ballistic missiles than America, and also for the bomber gap.
Mas, ao tomar posse, Kennedy descobriu o último segredo de Eisenhower. Nos últimos meses de seu mandato, Eisenhower conseguira obter informações confidenciais sobre o verdadeiro estágio do desenvolvimento militar dos soviéticos. O novo avião de espionagem U-2 e os primeiros satélites de reconhecimento com base no espaço revelaram o estágio do bombardeiro e dos mísseis soviéticos.
When Kennedy arrived in the White House, he was in for a major shock. There was no bomber gap. Indeed, it seemed that the Russians had hardly any bombers operational at all. There was no missile gap, and worse still, it appeared they didn't have an atom-powered plane. It seemed that there never had been an atom-powered plane.
Toda a história da Aviation Week sobre o avião soviético movido a energia nuclear tinha sido um embuste.
There never was a nuclear-powered aircraft. There was a bounder. They built one single aircraft, the M50 bounder, but it was powered by ordinary jet engines and it wasn't a very efficient aircraft.
Essas informações condenaram o projeto do bombardeiro atômico americano e todas as perspectivas de ressuscitar o WS-125.
All that remained when he became president was research and development on the indirect drive, the liquid metal drive, and even that we're no longer talking about an airplane. So when Kennedy became president, the program was 95% gone.
O bombardeiro atômico foi cancelado em março de 1961, um mês apenas após Kennedy chegar à Casa Branca.
The surprising thing is that just at the moment Kennedy was cancelling the A&P program, they were beginning to make breakthroughs in reactor materials that would lead eventually to lightweight reactors, particularly that could be used in spaceflight. Today, if you were trying to build a nuclear-powered engine for an aircraft, you could probably do so, given the technology we now have.
O avião movido a energia nuclear foi ultrapassado pelos eventos. Surgiram os submarinos nucleares Polaris da Marinha Americana. E agora, a América tinha mísseis balísticos de longo alcance, confiáveis e precisos. O bombardeiro tripulado, não importa qual a fonte de energia, tornara-se vulnerável a mísseis antiaéreos. O namoro da América com a aeronave nuclear tinha terminado. Mas a história do bombardeiro movido a energia nuclear tinha um último segredo a ser revelado, o maior de todos. No início dos anos 90, soube-se que a União Soviética, em 1961, colocara em voo uma aeronave atômica.
Everyone was dumbstruck after the fall of the Iron Curtain to discover that, after all, the Russians had flown a nuclear-powered aircraft. They flew it 40 times, but this was in the 1960s, and they did it by simply not shielding the crew.
Khrushchev was so concerned by what he perceived to be American progress in building an atomic-powered bomber that he demanded one of his own. And the truth of the matter was that the Russians were playing catch-up. They built a fairly crude direct cycle engine, and with fairly basic shielding that not only irradiated the crew, but also passed all kinds of contaminated air into the environment as it flew.
Os russos escolheram o Urso como avião de teste. Ele tinha 2 motores turbo convencionais e 2 motores a jato experimentais de ciclo direto. Esses eram movidos por um reator instalado na fuselagem principal. Alguns dos 40 voos foram realizados entre 1961 e 69 com o piloto de teste E.A. Gurionov.
I actually have a letter from test pilot Gurionov. He writes, "We had all been irradiated, but we ignored it. Of the 2 crews, only 3 men survived, a young navigator, a military navigator, and me. The first to go, a young technician, took only 3 years to die."
O problema de proteger a tripulação da radiação em um avião movido a energia nuclear nunca foi resolvido. Mas as ideias básicas do projeto do NB-36 continuaram a influenciar a pesquisa militar nos Estados Unidos.
Whenever you spend money on high tech, there's always the possibility and usually the reality of some useful fallout.
Em abril de 1961, um mês após Kennedy cancelar o programa do bombardeiro nuclear tripulado, foi firmado um contrato com a companhia Chance Vought para a construção de um míssil atômico de cruzeiro. Por não haver tripulação, não demandaria blindagem. A nova arma teria motor de reação de ciclo direto.
Just as I was leaving the directorship at Livermore, we took on the responsibility for the reactor design for the nuclear cruise missile. The cruise missile is just a pilotless airplane. You got this direct drive engine. It's just like it's a lot of parallels between it and a nuclear airplane, except since it didn't have a pilot, the shielding problem was not the same.
O novo míssil foi chamado de SLAM.
Chance Vought got as far as building a 1/3 prototype of the SLAM. The final design for the SLAM would be a missile that was 65 foot long. It would be fired up to high altitude to get as far as it needed to go. It was indeed a missile that would have infinite range, being nuclear powered, but then it would drop down to 100 feet and be going at Mach 3, so this thing was absolutely unstoppable.
Além do lançamento de bombas nucleares, os cientistas de Livermore consideraram o uso do próprio reator como um dispositivo letal para contaminar território inimigo. Seria a arma do juízo final.
You run it close to the ground, it fries everything. I mean, on top of everything. So there the radiation was an advantage rather than disadvantage.
Em 1964, o SLAM estava pronto para o teste. Mas a política interveio novamente. Kennedy e Khrushchev confrontaram-se em Cuba e o mundo chegou perto da destruição nuclear. Como consequência, Kennedy e Khrushchev assinaram um tratado de interrupção de testes nucleares.
I think the death knell of the nuclear-powered aircraft and the nuclear-powered missile came with John Kennedy. He was looking towards an accommodation with the Soviets. To have gone into that kind of nuclear technology would have been a provocation. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the general public knew how close they'd come to nuclear war.
O programa SLAM foi cancelado em 1964. Mas o sistema interno de orientação desenvolvido para o SLAM foi utilizado mais tarde em mísseis convencionais que fazem parte hoje em dia do arsenal dos Estados Unidos.
In the end, the nuclear-powered aircraft was killed by simpler, cheaper technology. I mean, even in-flight refueling, which is routine these days, robbed it of the advantage of being able to fly forever. And the ballistic missile, which can hit a target on a postage stamp, or the cruise missile with its accuracy, that did away with the need for the big bomber.
Mas o sonho do voo nuclear talvez não tenha acabado. Em 2003, foi revelado que o Laboratório de Pesquisa da Força Aérea Americana iniciara 2 estudos sobre versões nucleares do Global Hawk da Northrop Grumman. O Global Hawk é um veículo aéreo não tripulado. Seu principal papel é de plataforma de reconhecimento de grande altitude e longo alcance. Foi projetado para voar dos Estados Unidos para qualquer lugar do planeta e circular durante dias, enviando informações para a base. O plano agora é dar ao Global Hawk uma autonomia de voo de vários meses. Terá a tecnologia que criou o NB-36 finalmente chegado à maturidade? Virá o dia em que aeronaves não tripuladas ficarão nos céus durante meses ou anos? Este era o sonho do bombardeiro atômico original, o WS-125, um dos aviões que nunca voaram.